Very much for the wonderful introduction. You make me sound very busy. Thank you again for inviting me. This has been a great opportunity. I would like to start with a reading. So if you could please join me in Gasho. When we meditate on the true nature of the universe and every sentient being, we will realize, as the Buddha said, that all life is oneness. Oneness is all. So we do not control life at all by ourselves. And when we pass away from this world, we enter into the infinite life and light. This life and light is not discriminated by my own life or my own light. It belongs to all sentient beings. Even the air amplifies this. It spreads all over so that the air we breathe is the same here, whether it's in Asia, Africa, or Europe. All sentient beings are one in the same condition. This is the teaching of the Buddha, and every sentient being will be enlightened, not just humans, but cats, dogs, birds, and fish, and all are my brothers and sisters. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. So that reading that I just read was written by Reverend Hosen Seki, who was the minister that founded the New York Buddhist Church. And he had this writing that's been very popular, and we use this at every animal memorial service. Because I think what hopefully you'll get out of my talk today is that as Buddhists, we see the world a little differently, perhaps. And I think it's really simplified by us how we relate to animals. So before I start my Dharma talk, I do want to say I am very excited to be part of visiting the Sangha because Minnesota is a very rich part of my family's history. My dad's side of the family are all born and raised in Minnesota. They were immigrants from Norway, the typical, stereotypical Minnesota situation. And we're very fortunate because my nephew, we actually still have the steam trunk. It's only about this big. And on the top, it says, going to Minnesota. And it had about 5 or 6 extra letters for Minnesota. And it's like how it got there. And so my great-grandfather was the first person to immigrate. And my family, up until my father's generation, were farmers. And so my father lived all over Minnesota. But I had the joy of having him live with me for the last 2 or 3 years of his life in Fresno. And it's fun because having your parent as a roommate can be challenging, but he was starting to tell me all these stories that I'd never heard of before. And the one story that he didn't tell me about my great-grandfather is that he came from Norway and he ended up being a spy for the northern country in the Civil War. And what they did, because they thought he couldn't speak English, they sent him down to Atlanta and just had him wandering around the streets. So they're saying, oh, that silly Norwegian, he doesn't understand. And he was spying and sending the information back to the North. And he actually won a medal for that. I said, Dad, how could you not tell me this story all my life? This is amazing. So that's my uncle, my great-grandfather that immigrated to Minnesota. So again, as I said in the introduction, we do have a memorial service for animals. And I know that when I first started attending the Seattle Bed Swing all those many years ago, I found it a little strange, to be honest. And when you go to a bed swing, so those that might not be aware, a bed swing is a head temple, and they're usually quite a bit larger. So at Fresno, which I served, and as a member of Seattle, there would be dozens of animal pictures up there. And it's very touching for people to relate to the stories. And a lot of times when we have the children and we talk about impermanence, that how nothing stays for the same forever, that everything passes on, it's a very gentle way because most of the kids have probably had the unfortunate experience of having a loved animal and have it pass on. And then as a minister or as minister's assistants, we take that opportunity to share the Buddhist teachings and how to work through that. Living in New York, Sensei was like smiling because, I lived in Japan, but I was like 25 years old. Now I'm 62 and moving to New York has been a little stressful to say the least. Being from California and giving up a car, I'm glad I don't have a car in Manhattan. But the density of the area, I think they say there's 3,000 people per quarter mile in this part of Manhattan. And you see all forms of life walking down the streets. I see animals that are in special baby strollers. I see people that have taken their cats or dogs and have dressed them up. The new trend in New York, and maybe you can start this in your neck of the woods, is that they have like little tennis shoes that they put on dogs. Maybe you're doing it there because you have snow in the wintertime. But it reinforces that how we do love our animals and how they are an important part of our life and how they can also be a substitute for children. Unfortunately, I never had children. So over the years, I'm a cat lover and I've always had a cat in my life, and they're such an enriching part of my life. Um, so my mother, who was also raised on the farm, but she's from Seattle. Um, I had my cat Akina. I had her for 14 years. I'm very fortunate. Most of my cats lived to be about 14. I had a cat in Japan, believe it or not. I got a kitten in Japan, brought it back to the United States. For those that have ever traveled to Japan, it's funny because you have to have a document. And so my vet filled out all this kanji, all this beautiful Japanese, and I bring the document to Seattle and I hand it to the customs people and they go, okay, whatever, bring the cat in, right? Because they couldn't read anything. Peiko lived to be 21 years old. So that was amazing. So I had such a great experience with him. I really did miss him when I left, when he passed on. But getting back to my mother, I went on a trip and I brought Akina to the house for her to look after. And she goes, well, do they really use the litter box? And I'm going, well, what do you mean, Mom? Because one of the things I think a lot of us don't realize that litter boxes were invented in the 1950s. So when my parents were growing up, the cat went out at night and the dog came in, right? And so she just was marveled how she would use the litter box. Also, having animals in our life, it's how we look at them and how we interact with them. And we all talk about interdependence, that no one or anyone is by themselves, that we all need to understand the connections that we have. And it's the same way with our animals. Now, I was raised as a Christian, being Norwegian American is Lutheranism, of course. And one of the things that I remember my grandma telling me about is that how animals were put on earth for us, that God created animals for our pleasure. Also, you can look at that as a source of food. I'm not a vegetarian, so I'm guilty of consuming animals, but I would like to think that when I say itadakimasu, is that I'm seriously taking a moment to reflect upon a creature that has given up its life. And I try to be ethical with what type of products that I buy, because I do know there's a lot of cruelty in bringing up livestock. But getting back to the idea is that we appreciate them. That when they give up their life, we appreciate them. We do not take that in vain. One of my friends who is a vegetarian, if they go to a party and there's nothing that they can eat as a vegetarian, they will eat the meat because they said, in their view, it's a worse sacrifice for an animal to give up its life and then not even having it being consumed. Now, when I was living I bought my first house. My first assignment was in Fresno, and I lived in the bungalow part of California. I always wanted a bungalow, and I was very fortunate to get one. And so my neighbors were artists and some very interesting people. And my next door neighbor's name was Lolly. And Lolly would come up to me and she says, I'm a burned out hippie. I go, okay, Lolly, you're a burned out hippie. She was probably 75 at this time. And she tried to convert me to Christianity, and that was interesting. And then we had a housewarming party, and she was wondering why my house is filled with like 150 Japanese American people. She says, what was that? And I said, that's my congregation. And then when she found out as a Buddhist. But anyway, so we had a good relationship. But she came over one day and knocked on the door, and my dad answered the door. And he came back I was in the back porch, and he says, I just want you to know that Lolly's going in for surgery. And I said, oh, that's too bad. He goes, yeah. And she says, don't worry, because she had a bunch of outdoor cats, maybe half a dozen outdoor cats. And she says, don't worry about the cats. I had them taken away and put down. So if I die, they'll be waiting for me in heaven. Yes, I can see some of your faces. I am so glad that my dad answered the door, because I don't know if I could have kept my calm. And so I thought, in her mind, everything is created for her. It was very dualistic. This is my cat, even though it's an outdoor cat. It's like, well, why not take it to a shelter and let someone else have the cat? And so I had a conversation with my dad. He goes, well, that doesn't seem very kind. And I said, again, in the Buddhist part of the point of view, that we're all interconnected, and that the idea that she is having these cats put down to wait for her for something else is something that we would never appreciate in Buddhism. So one of the other stories I like to talk about is that I did have a cat called Gato, and I think Sensei doesn't realize that poor Gato passed. It was a very busy time when I was getting ready to move to New York, and Gato was 17 years old. And so he passed on. And again, the idea of how people relate to animals and not understand or appreciate their sacredness. I was going to the Institute of Buddhist Studies, and I was living in an apartment building in Oakland. Actually, I was on the same street as the temple, and I was near Lake Merritt. And we weren't allowed to have animals. And I was craving not having an animal in my life. And so I was going to the laundry. And so I was on the third floor, and you had to go down the staircase, and then the laundry room was in the basement. Now, this was I laugh because the building was built the same year that I was born. It was a 60s modern building. And I thought, oh, I hope I look in better shape than this building does, right? So the staircase is one of those like Jetson ones where it's like, it's a piece of concrete and then there's nothing behind it, and then it goes down. So it's like very easy to fall off. Well, I go out, and I had neighbors that would argue all the time. They had a very dysfunctional relationship. You could hear them yelling down the hall. And so, and I heard her yelling, and she went out the front door, and I heard him yelling, and he went out the back door. And so I had my laundry basket, and I walk in and I open the door, and there is a litter box with a kitten about this big in it. And what's going on? Because the staircase, the cat could fall. And so I thought, okay, well, I can't leave the cat here. Something's going to happen to the cat. And so after I went up and down, the gentleman came back and said, do you want the cat? Do you want the effing cat? No one wants the effing cat. And he abandoned it. And again, the idea of treating this living being as something, as a material object that you don't care if it accidentally kills himself, was beyond conception to me. And so what I did was I took the cat back to my apartment, and the manager was in a unit next to me. And I said, I have rescued this cat. And he says, well, you can't keep it. And I said, okay. So the next day he says, well, maybe you can keep it, but don't let the owner see it. Well, Gato had a personality into the day he died. So my front door had a gap that big. And so Gato would put his paw under the door and be going like this. And then when you take the elevator up, you hear meow. Yeah, it's like the world's worst kept secret was Gato. And I was doing the Institute of Buddhist Studies, and I was writing my thesis. So we're talking hundreds of hours in front of the computer. And of course, the kitten doesn't like you not being on the computer. One of the funny things is that I had an Obutsudan from Japan next to my computer, and it had a picture of the river of fire and the river of water above it. And so when Gato got older, for attention, he would jump up on top of the Obutsudan and start whacking the river of fire and river of water. I'm like, oh my gosh, I said, you're not going to make it to the Pure Land, Gato, if you keep this up. And he got so big that he cracked the top of my Obutsudan. And I'm like, oh my gosh, and but that was a very special feeling for me. And my love for Gato and our love for animals and us remembering them today is that the long-term impact they have on our life. So when I was assigned to Fresno, they wanted me to do the Dharma School article in the newsletter because the other minister was near retirement age. And so I came up with the idea. I called it Gato's Corner. And it was a narrative where Gato taught. And of course, it is Gato, the humble Buddhist cat. I might actually publish some of these for the kids because people really like them. Gato got fan mail from Hawaii and Japan, Gato's Corner. Because Gato, the humble cat, what's the least humble animal that you can be aware of? It's a cat, right? And so then Gato would be very egotistical and have these conversations back and forth. And then when I got Safi, who's still with me, then they would talk back and forth. And it was interesting because people could relate to the cats. If I had made these a little boy and a little girl, I don't think it would have been as effective because that universality of loving animals and how compassionate we have as we feel towards them. So today, I'm glad that it was nice to see all the animals. I love the pictures, especially one of the dogs had a hat on. I was like, that was interesting. And it gives it a much more personal feel. And like I said, it's a time for us to reflect on our interdependence, how we're all connected and share the Buddha Dharma and also interconnected with our Buddha nature. So I would just like to reread just a little bit of that passage that I started off with because one of the things that might be interesting for you, I'm going to be doing a celebrity wedding here in New York. I got a call and this couple came in and I thought she looks really familiar. And so, but it can't be that person. And so then we sit down and do the paperwork, and it's Bernadette Peters. Remember the Broadway star, movie star? I've always liked her, and I got starstruck. It's like, okay, I got to be professional, Reverend Rye. You can't get all googly over this. But the reason she's doing the wedding here is because she saw online Dharma talk with this passage being read by one of our minister's assistants. She wants this read at the wedding. And Hoshina, who is the minister's daughter who's still alive, was very touched that her father's words, all these 80 years later, are still being cherished and shared with people. So I'd just like to reread a little bit of the ending of that. So if you could join me in Gasho, please. Every sentient being will be enlightened, not just humans, but cats and dogs, birds and fish, and all are my brothers and sisters. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Well, thank you, Reverend Rye. I really appreciate that wonderful Dharma message. And I'm so happy to meet you and welcome to the Eastern District. And we look forward to you coming to visit Minnesota since you have ties here. So that was an interesting story about your family ties. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.